At 2:34 a.m., satellite tracking detected 6 ballistic missiles launched from Eastern Coalition coastal sites on trajectory toward our southern maritime bases with 11-minute impact projection. At 2:36 a.m., Regional Defense Command elevated to condition red and activated missile defenses. At 2:38 a.m., the executive was notified the coalition was retaliating for our air operations, conducted 7 hours earlier against coalition naval facilities. Those operations had been authorized by executive order without legislative approval. The legislature had explicitly denied authorization 48 hours before the executive ordered strikes anyway. Now, the coalition was retaliating, and commanders faced whether they could fire back without the legislative war declaration that had been denied 2 days ago. Subscribe to this channel immediately, because what you are witnessing is not a foreign policy crisis. This is a constitutional crisis occurring during active missile flight. This is the executive ordering retaliatory strikes while the legislature maintains its denial of war authorization. This is military commanders being ordered to launch counterattacks while constitutional scholars argue whether defensive retaliation requires legislative approval when the initial strike that provoked the enemy response was itself unauthorized. Turn on notifications, because the next 6 hours will determine whether the executive can bypass war powers restrictions by provoking retaliation, whether our forces fire back without legislative consent, and whether the constitutional framework for controlling military escalation survives its first test under enemy fire. Here is what led to this moment. 72 hours ago, the Eastern Coalition closed international shipping lanes through the Strait of Caspian, claiming joint naval exercises in the region constituted provocative military buildup. 48 hours ago, the executive requested legislative authorization for limited strikes to reopen the lanes. The legislature's Foreign Affairs Committee voted 31-22 against authorization, stating the closure did not constitute imminent threat and that diplomatic measures should be exhausted first. But here is where it shifted. 19 hours ago, despite legislative denial, the executive signed National Security Directive 22, Bravo, authorizing strikes against 3 coalition naval command centers and 2 radar installations. The directive cited Article 7's executive command authority and argued enforcing navigation freedom is defensive action, not requiring legislative approval. At 7:47 p.m. yesterday, our aircraft struck designated targets coalition air defenses engaged. Initial assessments indicated command facilities significantly degraded. At 9:12 p.m., the coalition's defense ministry announced proportional response was authorized. At 11:34 p.m., the legislature passed a resolution condemning the executive's unauthorized strikes and demanding immediate cessation pending legislative debate. The resolution stated the actions violated constitutional war powers and threatened impeachment. At 11:47 p.m., the executive responded that strikes were defensive and did not require legislative declaration. Now watch what happens next. At 2:34 a.m., the coalition launched retaliation. At 2:41 a.m., our defenses intercepted 4 missiles. 2 struck base Delta -7, causing significant damage. Initial reports indicated 12 personnel killed and 37 wounded. Medical teams were still extracting casualties from collapsed structures. Air defense crews at the base reported they were prepared to engage additional incoming threats, but needed clarification on whether they were authorized to strike coalition launch sites that were actively targeting them. At 2:43 a.m., Regional Defense Command requested authorization to launch retaliatory strikes. At 2:47 a.m., the executive signed Retaliation Authorization Alpha -9, directing immediate counter-strikes and expanding targets to include coalition air defense networks. The authorization stated the coalition's attack triggered automatic defensive response authority. At 2:51 a.m., the legislature's Defense Oversight Chair issued a counter-directive prohibiting retaliatory strikes, stating the coalition's attack was response to our unauthorized initial strikes and that retaliating would escalate into full-scale war without approval. Drop a comment right now. Tell me whether commanders should follow the executive's retaliation order or comply with the legislature's restraint directive. I am reading every response because this is the question every battle group commander and missile battery officer is confronting at this moment. At 3:04 a.m., the Joint Strategic Command held an emergency conference. Legal counsel stated the situation presents unprecedented constitutional ambiguity. The executive argues coalition fire created automatic defensive authority. The legislature argues our unauthorized initial strikes mean retaliation constitutes continuation of unconstitutional operations. The command's lawyers could not provide definitive guidance. According to sources in the conference, one flag officer stated that refusing to retaliate while personnel are under threat violates the oath to defend the nation. Another responded that executing unconstitutional orders violates that same oath. The conference ended with no consensus. At 3:17 a.m., the defense minister stated our forces have been attacked, 12 are dead, and the coalition must face consequences. At 3:29 a.m., the legislature's Foreign Affairs chair responded that the executive provoked this retaliation through unauthorized strikes, and that retaliating now will start a war the people's representatives have not authorized. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what I'm about to show you is how constitutional war powers doctrine fractures when the executive initiates hostilities, the enemy retaliates, and the legislature maintains its denial of war authorization. At 3:41 a.m., 3 carrier battle group commanders reported strike packages ready but requested written confirmation that retaliation orders are constitutionally valid, stating launching strikes could constitute participation in unconstitutional war operations at 3:54 a.m. The defense minister provided written confirmation the authorization is lawful under defensive response doctrine. At 4:07 a.m., the legislature passed an emergency resolution 38-29 explicitly prohibiting any retaliatory action without formal war declaration. The resolution stated the executive's retaliation order is void and that commanders executing such orders will face investigation. During the vote, 7 legislators who had previously supported the executive's foreign policy voted for the prohibition, stating that while they supported strong defense, bypassing constitutional war powers was unacceptable. 4 legislators who opposed the initial strikes voted against the prohibition, arguing that once American personnel are killed, retaliation becomes a defensive imperative regardless of how the conflict started. At 4:12 a.m., the executive stated the resolution does not override constitutional authority to defend forces under attack. There is a detail most people missed. Article 7 grants the legislature exclusive war declaration power and grants the executive command authority over armed forces. But there is no clause addressing whether the executive can order retaliatory strikes when enemy attacks were responses to executive actions taken without legislative approval. The framers anticipated enemies attacking first. They did not anticipate the executive provoking retaliation through unauthorized strikes and then claiming defensive authority. At 4:28 a.m., Allied governments issued statements calling for de-escalation. One ally stated it would deny base use for retaliatory strikes, lacking legislative authorization. A second ally suspended intelligence, sharing pending constitutional resolution. A third ally's defense minister stated publicly that participating in operations without proper democratic authorization would violate their own constitutional requirements for military cooperation. The Allied withdrawal meant our strike packages would lose critical refueling support and forward staging capability. At 4:46 a.m., the coalition warned any further attacks will trigger expanded retaliation. At 5:03 a.m., intelligence reported coalition forces mobilizing additional missile batteries. This is the moment it stopped being a constitutional debate and became an operational decision under active threat. At 5:14 a.m., Regional Defense Command reported coalition radar showed indications of preparing additional launches and requested immediate authorization to strike sites before they could fire. At 5:21 a.m., the executive reaffirmed authorization. At 5:27 a.m., the legislature sent direct communications stating any strikes beyond immediate missile defense violate constitutional war powers. At 5:39 a.m., the Joint Strategic Command issued guidance. Personnel must follow lawful orders and refuse unlawful orders. The lawfulness determination is disputed between branches. Commanders must exercise judgment based on constitutional obligations. That guidance placed the question on individual commanders rather than providing institutional direction. at 5:47 a.m. Two carrier battle group commanders notified command they would maintain defensive posture and not launch retaliatory strikes absent legislative war declaration, stating the legislature's explicit denial creates sufficient constitutional doubt. One of these commanders sent encrypted communications to their crew, stating that while the decision was difficult, executing potentially unconstitutional orders would dishonor the service at 5:52 a.m. One commander stated defensive retaliation against forces that attacked our personnel is clearly authorized and waiting for legislative process, while under threat is operationally unacceptable. That commander's strike aircraft were armed and positioned for immediate launch pending final authorization at 6:04 a.m. The Federal Reserve Bank stated operational funding for expanded operations requires legislative appropriation and discretionary funds cannot be used for prohibited actions. At 6:17 a.m., the Executive's Council responded defensive operations draw on standing budgets. Here are the indicators we are watching. Does the executive withdraw authorization? Does command issue unified guidance? Do any commanders execute strikes creating split response? Does the coalition launch additional attacks? Does the legislature move toward impeachment? Do allied governments withdraw support? Here are the three scenarios. Scenario 1, the executive orders restraint pending legislative debate. Facing command division and allied withdrawal, the executive postpones retaliation and requests emergency legislative session. This is the constitutional compliance scenario. Scenario 2, partial retaliation occurs. Some commanders execute strikes, others refuse. The attack is fragmented. The coalition responds with expanded attacks. Constitutional crisis deepens during active combat. This is the fracture scenario. Scenario 3, full retaliation proceeds despite prohibition. Commanders determine enemy attacks create defensive authority regardless of how conflict started. Strikes degrade coalition capabilities. The legislature initiates impeachment. This is the executive supremacy scenario. The federal Constitution has governed this nation for 153 years. Article 7 has been tested in multiple conflicts. In every previous case, either the legislature declared war first or the enemy attacked first, creating clear defensive scenarios. This is the first time the executive initiated strikes without authorization, provoked retaliation, and then claimed the retaliation creates automatic counterstrike authority. What I know for certain right now at 2:34 a.m., coalition missiles were detected at 2:41 a.m. 2 struck our base, killing 12 at 2:47 a.m. The executive authorized retaliation at 2:51 a.m. The legislature prohibited it at 4:07 a.m. The legislature explicitly denied authorization at 5:47 a.m. Battle group commanders split on execution. The coalition is preparing additional attacks. The executive has ordered counterstrikes. The legislature has prohibited them. Commanders are divided, and the Constitution provides no clear answer when the executive provokes retaliation to unauthorized strikes and then claims defensive authority. The question is whether constitutional war powers can constrain executive military action when enemy forces are actively attacking at 6:34 a.m. The Federal Military Operations Archive recorded the following entry. Executive retaliation authorization issued. Legislative prohibition recorded. Commander compliance divided. Coalition threat. Status active constitutional war powers doctrine unresolved under combat conditions. And whether retaliation occurs in the next hours will determine whether Article 7 survived its test under fire.